This is a case that would be referred to as Philadelphia's most brutal murder. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Eddie Pollock. Viewer discretion is advised. It was the night of November 11th, 1994. 911 was being flooded with calls about what appeared to be some sort of gang or teen violence ravaging through the streets of the Fox Chase neighborhood of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. After 40 to 45 minutes or so, police finally arrived and they got to the St. Cecilia's Church there in Fox Chase, and they found a beaten and bloodied 16-year-old boy near death. Had police responded sooner, he may still be alive. Edward Polec, who would go by Eddie, was born on January 21st, 1978. And Eddie lived his entire life in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania with his parents and his two siblings. He had a sister named Christy and a brother named Billy. Eddie was described as just a really nice guy, very mature for his young age. He would laugh and smile with ease. He would always try to make other people laugh. And most importantly, people remembered Eddie, even at the age of 16, as being just a really generous person. Not just like generous like giving money, but generous with his time, with his advice, with his ability to just try to make everyone happy. This is someone who, according to something I read, he would still try to bring like injured animals home, like injured birds or an injured squirrel, to try to like help them and make sure they didn't die. Like he would try to nurse these animals back to health. They said he had a soft spot in his heart for anyone or any animal who was in need or was weakened for some reason. And if he couldn't physically help, he would do something with his personality to help in any way he could. At the time of this story, he was in high school. He was also, he worked at a place called Boston Chicken. And I guess he really, really loved his job. He loved cooking. Many people believe that should he have been allowed to live, he probably would have been a professional chef. He would have probably worked something in the restaurant industry. That's how much he loved cooking and all that. They said at the very least, Eddie probably would have spent the rest of his life working in some way at some sort of job if it meant he could help other people. That's what he wanted to do. If only the 911 operators in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1994 would have extended him the same courtesy. And one of the worst parts is Eddie had no involvement in the situation that led to his death. He was a completely random person. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. So allegedly, the story goes that sometime a few days or a week or so prior to the incident on November 11th, 1994, there was a teenage girl. She was sitting in her car outside of the McDonald's in Fox Chase, and she was just eating her meal when all of a sudden someone threw a soda at her car, or dumped a soda on her in her window or through the sunroof or something along those lines. Someone poured soda on her or on her car, and this pissed her off, as it probably would anyone. And allegedly, the young girl, she would scream at the group of boys, teenage boys who allegedly did this, and she screamed at them, "You are all going to pay. You're all going to be beat up next week." Well, somehow this story of this young girl getting soda thrown on her in her car, it evolved into a story that I'm not clear if she started this or if someone else started this, but regardless, it was not true. It was just a stupid rumor. The soda story evolved into she was sexually assaulted by a teenage boy from Fox Chase. And so that spread, and it would reach the high school in Abington Township, which is outside of Fox Chase. And so from there, a group of teenagers from a high school in Abington Township decided they were going to take matters into their own hands, and they were going to seek vengeance for this girl who was supposedly sexually assaulted in Fox Chase. Their plan was to load up a bunch of cars with teenagers, drive to Fox Chase, and seek out whoever did it. Basically, it was vigilante justice. Fast forward now to the night of November 11th, 1994. It's approximately 9:30 p.m. A car full of teenagers parks at a 7-Eleven parking lot in Fox Chase. They are like asking people outside of 7-Eleven, hey, where is the McDonald's nearby? And then they get directions there. And so by approximately 10 p.m., the teenagers in that car are now at the McDonald's where the incident supposedly took place. The incident that was just someone throwing soda on the girl that somehow evolved into her being sexually assaulted. So once they arrive at the McDonald's, it's not just one car now, it's like 5 or 6, 7, 8 cars full of teenagers who are all armed with broken hockey sticks and baseball bats and various other instruments. They get out of their car and they start running around this McDonald's in these surrounding areas screaming. And this was a time of night when the teenagers in that area were always out and about just, hanging out and having fun. So these Abington Township teenagers were then chasing after any of the teenagers who lived in Fox Chase in that area. They're just chasing after them with hockey sticks and baseball bats, screaming at them, basically saying, we're going to, find out who did this. One teenager from Fox Chase had been knocked down and beaten with a baseball bat pretty badly, but was able to survive and not have any extreme injuries to them. And then it just spread like wildfire. I mean, everyone is running and screaming, and now you have teenagers and adults calling 911 at this point. These phone calls that go to the 911 dispatcher, they're basically saying, there's a group of, it really varies depending on the person who called, but some people said 10 or 15 teenagers, and at one point someone said there's 40 or 50 teens running around chasing people here in the area, screaming. They have weapons, they have baseball bats, they have hockey sticks, and the 911 dispatchers just didn't take it seriously. Because when police should have showed, at least one officer, someone should have showed up within minutes, nobody did. 5 minutes goes by, no one shows up. 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, no cops show up, despite receiving numerous phone calls about teenagers threatening people, especially other kids, with weapons, and the cops are just like, it's just kids being kids. Meanwhile, 16-year-old Eddie Pollock, who had absolutely zero connections to any of the teenagers involved in this situation, didn't know them. He didn't know the girl who kind of initially started this whole thing with the whole soda that led into the sexual assault fake story. He had no connection. But that time of night, he was actually standing on the steps of the St. Cecilia's Church, the church he attended. It's also the church where he was an altar boy for a couple of years. He was on those steps because he was waiting for his younger brother. I'm not sure what the situation was for why he was waiting for him, but he was there waiting for him. Eddie was there minding his own business when he kind of saw the chaos begin to ensue. The teenagers from Abington Township saw this kid just kind of on his own, so they decided to go after him. Now, at this point, they're all kind of back in their cars, and what they do is they all start driving towards where Eddie is, and Eddie kind of notices, and he tries to kind of get away because he hears what's happening. And so all of these cars with these teens pull up around him so he can't get away. And so they all get out of the car, and one of them takes this baseball bat and throws it at Eddie, which hits him in his knees or somewhere in his legs that causes him to fall to the ground. So now Eddie Pollock is being surrounded by this group of teenagers, and again, it's It's really unclear how many teenagers were actually there at this particular scene. It's not really known for sure, but Eddie allegedly was screaming and begging for them to stop, that he didn't know what was going on. He was like, just please leave me alone. But they wouldn't. What they did instead was they took baseball bats and they began to beat the ever-living Christ out of Eddie with the baseball bats. Just completely just ravaged him with the baseball bats. He is now on the ground, bloodied and beaten, and just defeated. And what they do is they pick him up so they can straighten him up and stand him tall. Then they take a baseball bat and they beat him over the head with it, as he's already completely just out of it. He's been beaten to a pulp, but they stand him up and they beat the shit out of him some more across his head. They then throw him to the ground, and I guess one or two of them had on steel-toed boots. And so they began to just kick Eddie in just all over, as just blood is pooling out. He is bruised. He's gone. He's gone. And then they were finally done with him. And so other teenagers would basically testify later that the teenagers who did this to Eddie started to laugh and joke, and they high-fived each other, basically saying, yeah, good job, we got him. Then finally, 40 to 45 minutes after the first 911 call came in, police finally arrive. But this is after Eddie Pollock has already been beaten within an inch of his life. So the teenagers get into their cars and they all speed away. Police found Eddie Pollock just lying in a pool of blood, barely recognizable because of how badly he was beaten, just lying on the steps of the church he attended with his family. An ambulance was called. He was rushed to the hospital where he would make it through the night, but by the following morning, he would be pronounced dead. And if you wanted any indication of how beloved Eddie Pollock was, his funeral was held, I believe, at the same church he was beaten and killed in front of. Pretty much most of the school that he attended showed up to that funeral. Most of the town appeared to show up to his funeral. They said close to 5,000 people showed up to this young man's funeral. The funeral procession was nearly a mile long. But everyone there kind of wondered, could Eddie have been saved? And kind of by that time, the 911 transcripts had been released and people had heard some of the calls, and apparently the 911 operators had either berated the people who were calling, kind of just treated them poorly, basically said, you're making this up or you're lying. Pretty much, had they responded within that first one or two phone calls they got, they would have likely just been able to disperse the teenagers, and Eddie Pollock would absolutely still be alive. I 100% believe that. From what I understand, I believe 4 or 5 of the 911 operators that night were fired after an investigation, and I think 2 of them were transferred to a different position at different locations. They would appeal all of those, terminations and transfers, but they would lose those appeals. There was a time when basically the 911 operators were all African American, and so what kind of tried to come to the surface was that this was like a racially motivated thing, that they were the black individuals, these 911 operators, were being treated as scapegoats. But after listening to the phone calls, I mean that's why they lost their appeals, because if they listened to the phone calls of people investigating this and said, you know what, unfortunately you treated these people poorly. Had you sent people out, a life could have been saved, and another teenage boy may not have gotten severe injuries. So it wasn't a racially motivated thing. It was just these are the individuals who were on those calls, who just didn't do their job. But this would lead into them completely fixing the 911 system and the call centers and all that. And so unfortunately, this event kind of had to happen for them to even notice that this was an overwhelming problem. Meanwhile, now they have a murder investigation, and so police in Fox Chase, they have to do this incredibly thorough investigation, very detailed, because, I mean, there are just rumors everywhere about who was involved, who wasn't involved. It's basically impossible to know how many teenagers from the Abington Township area were involved in this and who they were. It was a mess. Now, eventually, they would arrest 6 teenagers who were directly related to the murder of Eddie Pollock, and they also arrested another teenager, a 7th one, for the one who had beat the other teenager with the baseball bat, the teenager that did survive. There were issues with really only 7 people total were arrested for this, and it sounds like police knew that there were a lot more teenagers involved, but it becomes increasingly impossible to pinpoint each teenager to exactly what happened and what their involvement was. And so they had the most solid evidence, which is basically witness testimony and all that, for these 7 teenagers. They could have arrested more, but they didn't. The 6 teenagers who were directly related with the murder, all were boys. And apparently none of them showed any remorse. None of them apologized. None of them seemed to care about what they did to Eddie. I mean, they brutalized this young kid. I mean, for no reason. They didn't even... First of all, the sexual assault allegation, which confirmed was never true, never happened. They also didn't know who allegedly did that. And they just found someone, and they just beat him to death with hockey sticks and baseball bats. And they just were like, man, we did what we did. Oh, well. So unfortunately, I don't really have clear photos of the perpetrators. There's like 1 or 2 where you can kind of see them. But the 6 defendants were 18-year-old Anthony Rienzi, 18-year-old Nick Pinero, 19-year-old Thomas Crook, 18-year-old DeJuan Alexander, 20-year-old Carlo Johnson, 19-year-old Kevin Convey, and 18-year-old Bao Cantavong. I may have said that last name horribly wrong, and I'm sorry if I did. So all of the teenagers were charged as adults, because, I mean, they all were, because they're all over the age of 18. They did not put the death penalty on the table, however, because I guess just given how many teenagers were involved and how many teenagers that may not have been arrested, and because of all the circumstances behind it, there just wasn't going to be enough evidence to warrant a death penalty trial. Even if it was a death penalty case, Eddie Pollock's family were pretty adamant that they did not want that, because they were very, very much against the death penalty. Even though their son was brutally murdered, they felt that was just not the punishment that they would have wanted. So the trial would last for several weeks. There was a lot of testimony. This is primarily circumstantial evidence based on witness testimonies. They had to work through the whole soda tossing incident that led to this false sexual assault allegation. And the trial itself was, from what I understand, pretty chaotic at times. The teenagers would become belligerent and they would lash out in court. And again, they were all just assholes. Or at least most of them were just being complete dicks, showing no remorse or any care in the world about what they did. But in the end, all 6 teenagers were found guilty in their parts or involvement in the murder. Anthony Rienzi, Nick Pinero, and Thomas Crook, they were the 3 teenagers found to be the ones who basically wielded the baseball bats. They were the ones who actually physically committed the actions that led to the death of Eddie Pollock. And so all 3 of them were convicted, I guess, of 3rd-degree murder. The prosecution was going for 1st-degree murder, but again, there was just so much that it's really kind of impossible to know all the details. Those 3 teenagers were sentenced to 15 to 30 years in prison. DeJuan Alexander, he was sentenced to 8 to 20 years for manslaughter. Carlo Johnson, he's one of the individuals that I have a slightly better picture of. He was sentenced to 5 to 10 years for conspiracy, so he was not convicted technically of the physical murder. Bao Cantavong was also sentenced to 5 to 10 years for conspiracy. And then Kevin Convey was the only one who actually pled guilty without going to trial. He pled guilty to third-degree murder. And his testimony is ultimately what led to the convictions of all the others, because he agreed to testify against all of them and basically provide the evidence they needed. And so because of that, he was sentenced to 5 to 20 years for third-degree murder. There was just so much wrong in this entire case. I mean, the 911 situation was a nightmare. A life could have been spared had they responded immediately. We can't say that for sure. Can't be positive, but let's be real. If they responded within the first 2 to 3 minutes and had at least one car go there, Eddie Pollock may still be alive. Then you had this girl who allegedly started this rumor that she was sexually assaulted, and apparently she didn't really seem to care about her role. She was like very flippant about it, I guess, just based on what I read. Screw her. And then you had this mob of teenagers just running through the streets like wild freaking animals. And there's just like this entitlement they had that was just like, we can do this, and that's okay. And many of them got away with it. Many of them never even saw a single charge, never saw a jail cell. Many of them did what they did, scared the shit out of people, brandished bats and hockey sticks and said horrible things to people, and got away with it. And so that probably fueled their entitlement of, look what I can get away with. So God knows how they turned out. One other teenager was, I think, convicted or pled guilty to assault for the other teenager. I don't know how much time that person got, though. But I don't imagine it was very long. The trial was like in 1996, I believe. And so at this point, probably all of them would be out now. Yeah, they're all free. So hopefully prison helped change them. Who knows? But Eddie Pollock, this 16-year-old kid who was just waiting on the steps of his church for his little brother, was just a victim of wrong place, wrong time. He had nothing to do with any of it. And he was brutally beaten and tortured, really. And he suffered for a very long time, for hours at least, in pain. And for what? For what? For a lie. For a lie that had no involvement with him. It's amazing that things like this happened and still happen to this very day. And honestly, I mean, this may be an unpopular opinion. I don't know. Maybe it's a popular opinion. Eddie Pollock didn't get justice. He was savagely, brutally beaten with baseball bats. And his killers, they got a slap on the wrist, probably because they were so young. And now they're free, living life. They get to live the rest of their lives. They get to have families. They get to watch their kids grow up and go to high school and go to prom. They can watch their kids get married, and they get to, have jobs and careers, and they get to live. Eddie Pollock, meanwhile, is dead. He doesn't get that opportunity ever again. This wasn't an accidental murder. This wasn't a whoopsie daisy. This was a deliberate attack, and they're free. So Eddie Pollock, in my opinion, did not get justice. But that's just me, and that is it for this case. True crime, a Rooney Dooney Dingleberry dongle doos. No, don't get too fancy with it, Mike. Don't get too fancy. I'm not fancy. Anyway, hi. If you have tripped, fallen, and stumbled your way into this video by sheer accident, you big klutzy poo. Hello, I'm Mike. I tell true crime stories here on YouTube, also over on TikTok. So please feel free to subscribe to me here, give this video a like, and follow my TikTok page. That is in the link tree in the description of this video below. I sell merch. It's also in the link tree. I have a Discord server if you want to join it. It's also in the link tree. By the way, my merch, we do ship internationally. It's mainly t-shirts and hoodies and stuff. So, yeah. But that is it for this case. So, I will see you all for the next case, which will be on Wednesday. Why am I talking like a robot? William Shatner robot. I do not know. Does anyone even understand that reference? I don't. And for the 18 billionth time in a row, I don't know how to say goodbye. So I will try to say goodbye in another language. The language, I think, was washing machine. Okay.